revenue attributed to Google search were not Google search revenue. There are massive claims that MTA's vendors say, like track the entire buyer journey. It's absolutely not true. We saw this also between Meta and TikTok. We saw that Meta is driving higher quality traffic than TikTok.
Yeah, I was reading your recent article. You kind of ditched this revenue-only forecast for the stage-by-stage models, right?
Well, we can talk about what Zuckerberg said like a few weeks ago, like when he said, oh yeah, just give me your spend and I'll...
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Full Funnel Podcast. I'm Rohit, your host and your guide to all things AI-first marketing. Today, we're tackling one of my favorite hot button topics, which is life after multi-touch attribution. So you're going to want to stick around. So joining me today is special guest Charlie de Thibault, a marketing measurement maverick who runs nine-figure budgets and who's swapped out fragile attribution for some other methodologies. And he's not afraid to call it out on LinkedIn as well. Charlie, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for joining us today. It's great to have you here. Can you introduce yourself to our audience and maybe tell us a little bit about your background and growth dynamics?
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to have that conversation. So I started my career in trading and risk management in the investment banking. And then I moved to, I led the measurement team at Oracle before deciding to found the Growth Dynamics now a year ago, where we help clients to reduce CAC, increase margin, and scale profitably.
Awesome. Yeah, that's the need of the hour today in this world that we live in today. So Charlie, you've run measurement for companies, spending north of nine figures. That's a lot of budgets. What's the one thing that convinced you that basically that, MTA was essentially quietly bleeding margins for these budgets? And what pushed you to other methodologies instead?
So I have two examples. I have a B2B example from Oracle, and then I have a B2C example with one of my current clients. So I can start with the B2B example. So we had an MTA in place. We obviously see a lot of attribution on retargeting campaigns, on campaigns like content syndication, a lot of Google brand, etc. All of these bottom of the funnel campaigns.
Yeah.
We also had a lot of impression on LinkedIn using the impression MTA. Something sounded not right. And so what I did is that I started to dive into the sales node, because luckily at Oracle, we have like a very robust way of keeping the data, and so we can track it. And that's where the disconnect really started to appear. Like most of the Google search revenue attributed to Google search were not Google search revenue. When you sell high tickets, very word of mouth is actually extremely important. CEOs speak together. So that's how they pick a product, not because you target them 1,000 times on LinkedIn, because you send them like a lot of, we don't do this anymore very much, but close forms. And so, yes, that's where I really saw the disconnect on the marketing side, on the B2B side. And then on the B2C side, I mean, we can deep dive to another example a bit later, more in details about a specific use case. But I had a client, nine figures marketing spend, and about 2% of the total revenue was coming from TikTok and Meta, and it turns out that actually that number was actually 70%, which is much higher. And no, 40%. Sorry, 40%, which is like a lot higher. And the reason is because you can't track cross-device. People look on phone, they then buy on their computers. You can't. It's very difficult to track cross-campaign too. And so, yes, a lot of MTA vendors claim they have their knowledge graph, etc., but the effectiveness of those is really limited. And what you can see is that most of the touch point that they can track is really on the bottom of the funnel. And that's one thing too that is very important to mention, is that 95% of your buyers are out of market right now, but they're going to pick you because they know you when they start buying. And MTA is really, you start to be really able to track those touch points when the users start to engage, when the users start the buying process. but
Yes.
it's already too late when you look at how the buyer journey works. And
Absolutely.
so obviously there are massive claims that MTAs vendors say, like, track the entire buyer journey. It's absolutely not true. Or find the incrementality lift of a touch point. That's obviously also not true. But those are like two classic lies that we see a lot on MTA vendors' websites.
100%, absolutely. I believe everyone has to kind of acknowledge this shortcomings, right? That MT is good for essentially understanding what happens after they land on your site and essentially understanding behavioral analytics, most likely, right? Customer journey analytics, rather than using it to essentially make multi-million dollar decisions, right? Yeah.
So I can add to this. At
Yeah.
Oracle, we were actually using MTA for a use case that was working very well. It was a lead scoring method. So it
Okay.
was a buyer group lead scoring method. And that was very effective because once the people start to look into your asset and you can actually really track what's going on,
Yeah.
then you really have like an accurate MTA measure. But that will only work for the sales team, because the job of the marketing is not to capture the demand. The job of the marketing is to create the demand, something that
Exactly.
MTA contract at all.
Exactly. Yeah, I was reading your recent article where you basically showed how certain type of targeting looks efficient, but it's actually suffocating growth. Could
Mhm.
you maybe unpack that story and share some insights into what you mean there?
So I think the problem is that there are several reasons why we over-evaluate the effectiveness of retargeting. One is because you use MTA. Retargeting always look great on an MTA because it's bottom of the funnel, it's easier to track. And so retargeting campaigns will always look great on an MTA perspective, but there's no causation effect. It's not because somebody has seen the ad 1,000 times on LinkedIn that actually triggered this purchase. And more often it doesn't. And so the problem is when we go back to that discussion of like the 95% of people who are in market, well, you can retarget people for a very long time before they buy. And so one, it's really draining, increasing your CAC, reducing your margin, and also you might more likely to spend unnecessarily because you're not even sure that it had any impact on the purchase of the buyer.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's interesting. I think like essentially targeting is very tricky when it comes to these audience strategies, and there's plenty of conflicting thoughts on that as well.
Oh, sorry, I
In the
thought you mentioned
industry.
retargeting. Targeting is another one. We can go into this one. Yeah, so my article
Yeah.
about targeting. Yes.
Yeah.
So what I do see, and I've seen that in the B2C client, with the B2C clients I have right now, is that people search on their phone, buy on their computers.
Right.
And so when you look at the performance, you're like, oh, but all the conversion are happening on the desktop. So I should just focus on desktop. But the reality is that by doing that, you're actually going to reduce the revenue of your direct desktop because people look on their phone and then buy on their desktop. And so what I meant here is that we have to be very careful of what we do. You shouldn't jump too quick into targeting specific audience or specific dimensions. It's really important to understand how the customer buys before jumping into conclusion like, oh, mobile does not work, let's cut it. Because I've seen it happening. We cut mobile and then you see that the revenue on desktop is decreasing.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah, definitely. So let's talk a little bit about the session quality scoring itself, or essentially journeys within the session. You say that we should measure how a visitor behaves in each session and not just stitch together like an invisible journey of sorts. So what are the signals that sit, at the top of your high intent traffic checklist, essentially, right? And how have brands moved budgets after seeing those scores?
Okay, so the first reason why we want to do that is because when you use MTA, you're going to disregard all the touch points that you can't connect to a journey. And that's a lot of touch points that you disregard, and a lot of important one. And very often the most important one because they're the one creating the demand. And one solution to that, to not lose track of all of this, is to look at session. And so what we do is that we look at the time the user spent on the website, which specific page the user look at. For example, somebody who is interested by the product is very more likely to read the entire product page and go on the pricing page, or even go on the demo. Even if the user is not booking a demo, the user went on the demo page, which show a high level of intent. And by doing this, you can do this by channel. And very quickly, you're going to see very big difference across channels. And that will help you to understand which channel is the most effective to drive higher quality session. And what we do see is obviously the very bottom of the funnel, which is brand search, SEO, and direct, have very high intent session because those are returning users. But also what you can see is that, for example, what we saw personally is that display channels, for example, were driving very little intent. And so you can already kind of like look at the cost, because a lot of marketers use cost per impression, for example, or cost per session. But these sessions, it's like clicks. They're not comparable. Some sessions are more valuable than others. And then sometimes you can see that if you just focus on the high quality session, the programmatic display is more expensive than another one like LinkedIn, even if the cost per impression is way smaller, because there's also a bot traffic issue with programmatic and display. But we saw this also between Meta and TikTok. We saw that Meta is driving higher quality traffic than TikTok. Obviously, you should do it. That was for one case, for one company. It can depend on the company, but this is what we found out when we did it on our side.
Yeah, awesome, interesting. So some marketers basically don't trust what we call like self-attribution reports or numbers, right? You call it critical for long-term consideration funnels. How do you structure these questions, right? And what's an example of where those questions actually overturned a search budget, for example?
So there are multiple ways. First, the most famous one is just self-attribution. It's so you put this on a demo request, or on a B2C, you can put this after the purchase. Some people are worried that asking this question can impact the purchase, so which questionable. But the solution then is just to put it on post-purchase. And the first thing is that that measurement method measure things that others can't, which is word of mouth. The most profitable traffic is word of mouth. And so MTA, MMM, incrementality, none of these actually measure the level of word of mouth. MMM does to a certain extent because it goes into the baseline. But it's not. But baseline is more than just word of mouth. It's also a brand capital and so on. So it's the only way. The second thing is that it has a much longer memory than other measurement methods. So there is MMM and incrementality tests suffer from what we call signal decay. It's like over time, the signal is drawn into the noise. And so the concept of the ad stock, for example, only works if the signal is much higher than the noise over time. Otherwise, it's going to. So the idea that MMM can track the long-term effect via ad stock is not correct. And what I do see is that those qualitative questions that have actually a much longer memory than those models, which goes in opposition of what most people say. The other thing that people say is that we can't trust an answer. And I completely agree with that. And as we can't trust a single number. And this is why we use statistics. So you're not looking to pinpoint like what each individual has said. You want to look into distribution. What is the channel that comes the most? And then through that, you're going to build like a certain level of confidence. Exactly the same way you would do with numbers. And but that's the self-attribution. The other part that is more for B2B, which is working very well, is survey or introductory call with sales team. So we have the team asking, why us? Why now? What is the solution you're trying to solve? And this will really help the marketing team to understand what triggered the purchase, and can also help on the content. So what we did see is, but first, the first example is one example I mentioned earlier. This is with sales node that I saw at Oracle how MTA was wrong. And then on the B2C side, what we did see is that we had an MTA. I said there was 2%. So 1.5 was attributed to Meta, 0.5 from TikTok.
Mm-hmm.
And we implemented self-attribution
Right.
from that experience from Oracle. And then what happened is that we saw that 25% of people were mentioning Meta and 15% were mentioning TikTok. So it's 20 times more. And what we also found out is 30% were mentioning word of mouth, which was completely invisible before we implemented that. And then what we did is that we looked into session tracking, session quality, and we saw more or less the same number that what was said in the self-attribution report. So we had a second source saying the same thing. And then we had confidence to push the spend into those channels. And we did see all the numbers and the metric starting to ramp up, like first on the brand search, then on the traffic, and then later on the revenue.
Interesting. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about forecasting. I know it's a deep topic. My team is a huge believer in understanding the why behind these deals as well, right? I think there's just a lot of signals today that it makes it extremely difficult to understand the cause, right? In that, the B2B use case you mentioned earlier, you kind of ditched this revenue only forecast for the stage by stage models, right? What inputs made that work, and how did the accuracy shift after the change?
Yeah, so what we did is that, well, what I did is that we looked at very different, at almost each step in the funnel and the spend by channel.
Okay.
And so from the spend by channel, we evaluate how many MQLs we're going to have, direct and by channels. And then we evaluate the conversion rate to SQLs. And then we evaluate the conversion rate to pipeline at all the percentage probability to close from 10 to 100. And very interestingly, for the fun fact, what we did see is that so the sales team was putting the numbers themselves between 10 and 90. And it was a sigmoid effect, is that the sales team tend to under evaluate the conversion rate of those of their opportunities between 10 to 40, and then it jumped, and above 60 they start to over evaluate it, which is just a fun fact, but it was very interesting to see that. Then another thing that we saw is that sales team do create seasonality. You have an increase in conversion and revenue at the end of each quarter because they're going to get their bonus. So you do have seasonality in B2B, and obviously you have the normal seasonality of B2B with Q3 between being higher than the Q4 being higher than the others. And so we managed, and so we did a step-by-step funnel, and then we forecasted the bottom line of the next quarter. And it was accurate. We back tested it over several years, and we were always within that 20% error rate.
Interesting.
Which is large for an exec, even though I said, well, we have what we have.
Yeah.
But it was one much better than just drawing a line on the revenue expectation, which a lot of CFOs and CEOs do still today.
Yeah.
They just like look at the trend and to draw a line with a pen. And also it was a conversion opener, because we do see, for example, that some budget assigned to some campaign were driving MQLs, but they were never driving any SQLs, for example. So you had a lot of MQLs that was feeding the sales pipeline, and it was just annoying the sales team because none of these closed. So that was also helped us to have more open conversation about the real quality of those channels behind MQLs, because MQLs is a pretty bad metric, because there's a problem with the definition of it, and you can easily game it. I've seen it a lot.
Definitely.
And so know that forecasting tool had a lot of limitation. First, multi-collinearity. We didn't control for it. Diminishing return, not really. We didn't really, kind of did, but it's not perfectly. And then, because in the end, the reality to really understand diminishing return and multi-correlate is that you have to stop an initiative and start again, and create that movement in the spend so the model can understand that. So we didn't do that. And so, no, it was definitely not a bulletproof forecasting tool, but it was definitely better than what a lot of B2B finance teams are using today.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. I've seen the entire spectrum of all the different kinds of methods people use, and things have definitely moved or kind of improved over the years, right? When it comes to forecasting. Yeah, jumping on that theme, this show is obviously also a lot about how AI is now kind of changing the landscape. Everything from actually doing the modeling or forecasting and all of that versus also then automating a lot of things within the marketing organization, right? So let's take a little bit of a walk into the future, and maybe you can do some predictions and essentially looking like, let's say, 2 years out. Where do you see this, AI and agentic future start moving towards when it comes to like helping brands decide, where to scale and when to scale, and some of the other judgments that, but potentially always need a human in the loop to be involved.
Yes. So, well, we can talk about what Zuckerberg said like a few weeks ago, like when he said, "Oh yeah, just give me your spend and I'll give you the revenue," which
Yeah,
is that the first rule is if that AI optimization, budget optimization is built by a channel vendor,
yeah.
don't do it. Like their goal is to optimize their revenue, which means to maximize
100%.
your spend. So, and that's a big problem with PMax, for example. And then, and I think Meta is trying to push that too. So obviously you'll need to have a third party there who can control and put some red flags on a few of the initiatives, the creativity that channels have
Yeah,
to push you to spend more and thus increase their own revenue. I use it a lot.
yeah.
I think it's very good to do simple tasks that takes you a lot of time. I think it's very bad at doing complex tasks.
Hmm.
And so, for example, coding, it's not great at coding. Well, if what your plan is to build a website, yes,
Hmm.
okay,
Yeah,
it's simpler. If your plan is to understand measurements, no,
right,
it's not.
right.
I use it every day. Like it suggests like very bad things constantly all the time. It's not good at creating content. It's not good at writing. And so the thing is, we have to be a bit careful in the way we use AI. We use
Mhm.
AI for everything for the moment. And we
Right.
say, oh yeah, if you don't use AI, you're going to be replaced by someone who uses it. Yes,
Yeah.
that's true. But if you use solely AI and only that, you're going to be replaced by someone who's not only using it.
Mhm.
Because in the end, that might be wrong in 5 years, but today, like an AI can't code like an excellent coder, can't write
Yeah.
like an excellent writer, and can't create content like an excellent content creator. And so when you push AI into that, you're just an average. So you say, oh yeah, that's great. We can create some videos for cheap and stuff. Yes, but look at how difficult it is to get attention into for your attention from your content today on social media. If you're average, you're not going to have any revenue from it, any impact from it. And so
Definitely.
that's where you have to be a bit more careful with using AI. On the budget optimization part, so let's take the example of trading, for example. It's a 4.5 trillion dollar industry.
Yeah.
Algo trading works well on short term. It
Mhm.
doesn't work well on longer term time frame because of signal decay and the world being constant evolution.
Right.
And so the thing is, as long as that industry hasn't figured it out, I don't think a measurement company will. And
Exactly.
uh, and so
It's
and
pretty
so
much the same thing, right? Yeah.
it's right. Like
Yeah.
it's so yeah, a lot of companies will claim to do it, but
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of caveats. So you have to be very careful in letting an AI decide for you. I think we might get there, but as you know, like the best way for the moment to measure is
Mhm.
triangulation, and there's a lot
Yeah.
of specific use case.
Yeah.
As long as maybe one day the measurement industry will find out the right way,
Yeah.
and then it will be automatable. But as long as you can't systemize it, you can't
Yeah.
let AI doing it. And for the
Exactly.
moment, I don't think measurement is at the level we can systemize it.
Yeah. There's definitely a lot of advancements in the models and the tools out there, but yeah, trying to measure and optimize is basically trying to use math to figure out consumer psychology, right? And so
Yeah.
until we have enough data inputs on how quickly the environments change, and consumer behaviors change or economic condition changes, we won't be able to kind of predict that accurately.
And I think that's a problem that I do see in measurement too. We put too much confidence into the models.
Yeah.
I've worked on the trading floor for a long time, and the common saying on the trading floor is like the best way to lose money is to listen to an economist. And the reason is because economists are really confident into their model, but then when you apply it to the real world, everything falls apart. And I think there are a lot of economists in the measurement world today.
Yeah.
And when you talk to people who are really, practitioner and really like hard, stress testing those models, that's where you see the crack. But for example, on LinkedIn, we don't talk that much on the limitation of all of those models. And we should definitely talk more about it.
100%. Everyone is like touting MMM is like the go-to savior for everything, but when you really put it to the test, there's a lot of holes that can be poked, right? Yeah. Awesome. So let's move to a lightning round before we close up today. Some quick questions, one sentence answers. What's a KPI you peak at before coffee?
Gross profit. That's my favorite one. I don't like revenue. Like in finance, a company that makes revenue but no profit is called a zombie company, and that's for a reason. Like you want to scale, you want to be profitable. So gross profit is my key KPI.
100%. What's the most overrated B2B metric today?
Oh, MQL by very far. Like I don't even understand why that is a thing.
Yeah, I can imagine. What's an AI tool that saved you the most number of hours this quarter?
Well, ChatGPT. As I explained, there's a lot of like simple tasks that takes a long time to do. Simple scripting or SQL queries. ChatGPT is very good for those things.
Absolutely. What's a marketing myth that you bury forever?
Oh, that MTA works, 100%.
Indeed. All right, Charlie, that's a wrap for this edition of the Full Funnel podcast. Huge thank you to you for sharing your perspective. It's been a pleasure chatting and meeting you for the first time. To everyone listening, thank you for spending a part of your day with us. If you got any value from this conversation, please hit follow and subscribe so you don't miss another episode. And please consider forwarding this to your friend who's kind of rethinking measurement. And not to forget, please follow Charlie on LinkedIn as well. We'll be back next week with another guest pushing the boundaries of AI-driven marketing growth. Until then, keep testing, keep learning, and I'll catch you on the next episode.